Thank you very much to Afra for the invitation. Afra is a close family member. In fact, so close that two of our brothers in Afra have interchangeable surnames. They often move from Afra to IATA and back. Raphael and Gausul, congratulations. Now, today is a special day because I'm really delighted to see people again. It's been 3 years of not doing that. But it's also wonderful because today happens to be my birthday. So, thank you. So I spent the whole day with my phone blowing up constantly, but sitting in here and celebrating with my aviation family. And I'm looking forward to going back home where I'll be celebrating with my real family and of course, my extended friends. So today is a special day. That's why I'm dressed so festively and also in the Afra colors. And I think it's also very appropriate that we're talking about moving beyond the crisis. You know, we've got to start thinking outside of the reactive mode. And so I'm going to start with a few slides we're just going to talk through today. I'm going to show you a few slides that speak to the impact of any and everything on our aviation industry and what it is that we should be doing to think about things differently. But before I do that, I'd like to ask a question to the room. And I'd like anyone, to answer, 1, 2, 3, just very spontaneously. If you had a blank sheet of paper and you could fix Africa's aviation challenges, what would you write on it? Regulation? Connectivity? Sorry? Again? I didn't hear it. High fares, okay. Regulation, connectivity, and fares. Training. Sorry? Training skills, okay, great. So let's give it a go. Remember those things that we heard, regulation, connectivity, high fares, and so on. So let's start first with what's happening. We've been talking a lot about aviation, but let's just put things in perspective, right? So we have global forecasts, as you know, and IATA tends to forecast, 10, 20 years in advance to see what the aviation industry is going to look like. And we're starting to see a post-pandemic positive move in the right direction, looking at where we were in November 2021, the blue line, and you can see where the red line is heading now. So we're starting to see an improvement. And there's some setbacks, though. One of those points I was mentioning about what impacts the aviation industry. The setbacks come from, government decisions, whether or not a country or another will keep their borders open or will change their, visa policy and so on. Asia is still weak, and of course, we have the war in Ukraine. The other issue is the sales, the volume. Aviation is a volume business. So we look at our international bookings and look at that till February of 2022. We're starting to see an uptick. Domestic was doing very, very well. We've talked about that before, recovery cycles, domestic first, regional, and then international. So you can see that, but we're starting to see a slightly different picture, which I'll talk to you about. We talked already a lot today about the impact of fuel prices, and many know that for airlines, their business really runs on that, on fuel, and it is a huge component of their costs. And when you start to see, global projections of 25 to 30% of airlines' operating costs being fuel, and in certain cases like Nigeria, where we're hearing that it's almost 70%. I mean, that is simply unsustainable. So this is a big factor, another one that impacts the industry. There is a strong upward trend in vaccination, and guess what? That's probably why most of us in the room are here, because we don't have to go through the hassle and the cost of PCR testing before you travel, on arrival, and so on, back and forth for every leg of the trip. And so if you're fully vaccinated, and you can prove it, you can come into most countries around the world, and that has helped a lot. Of course, the purple line, there's still many African countries who are not there yet in terms of full vaccination, but it's really helping to ease travel. Now, speaking to domestic, it's a positive story generally, but there is a slight downgrade that we're starting to see and a slight uptick for international travel, which is very good news for international travel. And finally, speaking to Africa's recovery, this is again comparing 2019 to 2022 as of February, you can see how Africa has recovered in terms of different parts of the world. The domestic, of course, being quite strong, intra-African being 65%, to Europe 75%, to Middle East 88%, to North America 93%, and Asia-Pac 13% for obvious reasons. So, strong recovery, and we've got to take advantage of that. But what does all of that mean? It means that, one, the industry is an industry that is highly vulnerable and susceptible to different kinds of external shocks. Whether or not we do anything about it, things happen, it affects the industry. And so the message there, and I think we've heard some of that today, is as an industry, we've got to stay agile. We've got to stay proactive. There are certain things that come along, the black swan event of COVID that nobody could have predicted because it affected the whole world. But the point is, if as an aviation business or as an industry, we are thinking that way, then it should help us in terms of resilience and adapting to shocks. So moving forward, the pathway to recovery, that's one of the things I'm talking about today. What is our advocacy focus? In 2020, we had these 5 pillars of these colors. Safely restarting the system at the time, safety and security and so on, safely reopening borders were closed, keeping the borders open, restoring customer confidence, and airlines' financial sustainability. Well, fast forward to 2022, we are still looking at many of these. So blue is already in the works, but we keep an eye on safety and security always. But our key focus is the other 2 slides, so the gray and the yellow. And in there, we're really looking at how we can simplify, how we can digitalize, how we can harmonize where possible, and how we can ensure that there's proper communication of what's happening across the world. So, and of course, looking at the green part, and we heard a bit about this already, extension of government aid, or at least support from governments, is still important because the industry is not quite out of the woods yet. So our focus is on these issues, the key messages for recovery. The first one is make vaccines available to all. And for those who work with the African Union, the African CDC has done a great job in trying to support that. Several governments have championed it, South Africa and a few other countries. But we do need to ensure that most Africans do have access to vaccines so that they can also enjoy what we're enjoying here today, which is the ability to move and the freedom to move. Now, the second issue is allow fully vaccinated travelers to face no additional barriers. One of the things that is interesting I want to talk about, and to Alan's point earlier about how Africa pioneers things, did you know that African markets were largely open in terms of international air travel since September 2022? When did the US open? September 2020. Since September 2020. US opened in 2021, right? Or October, Steve, yes. October 2021. Most of the European markets were still closed up until summer of 2021. Most of the African markets were open, but the impact of their opening, what was it? We've seen already the numbers in terms of international traffic is 2% of global traffic. So if you're open, but you're not really attracting traffic and you're not really, taking traffic out, and so because of that, it didn't really resonate with the rest of the world, that Africa had already done what the rest of the world was struggling with. Again, Africa is one of the countries very early on, such that as of today, most key markets in Africa are open to travelers on the basis of full vaccination without the need for pre-departure testing. So testing is only required if you are not fully vaccinated across most markets in Africa. That's the reality, that's the key on the ground. And then if you must use testing, what we're saying is use the cheaper versions. Use antigen testing, which is now as reliable as PCR, but you can get for a fraction of the cost. And is also cheaper, easier to access. You can get your results in time and so on. And finally, as we're coming out slowly from the pandemic, well, we've learned some lessons. We're learning how to live with it, moving from pandemic to endemic. Maybe there are some things within that air transport corridor that we can start to sunset. What are the things that we don't need to do anymore? We can see already that the heavy disinfections that we used to have across the terminals and across the aircraft, those have come off. Of course, they're still as careful as possible and still maintaining some of those health protocols on board, but there are a number of these that need to come off. So that's the second message. Remember what we had said at the beginning, what are these issues? So regulatory, connectivity, price. I'm going to come back to that. So what are the key markets here is, the key issue is use risk-based frameworks. We have enough data and information now to know which markets we can open to and so on. And so let's continue with the strict regimes. The third point is cost containment. So honestly, I personally don't really see a significant forward movement in African aviation until we can address this issue. The price of air travel is simply too high. You have 1.3 billion people, and less than 10% of that population can fly by air, most of whom are officials or in private sector. So it's just not, and we've heard already, we just heard it, how aviation can really be this catalyst. So this is a key issue towards recovery. We have those travel costs, impediments to economic growth, the major drops in traffic we're recovering from, the infrastructure, Gainmore mentioned it in his presentation, that infrastructure is not inadequate per se, but it's just a question of investing it in the right way and purposing the infrastructure that we have to suit the purposes and to suit what we need. And of course, the issue of charges and taxes and how governments address this issue. And I just want to just again highlight this. Some of you might have seen this before, but as we're coming out of COVID and we're in recovery mode, it's important for us to see this again. The number of taxes, and remember, taxes are the things that go into the government's coffers, not back into the industry. So it's not a charge. So the taxes, we have several of these. We have solidarity tourism, passenger departure and arrival taxes, fiscal stamp taxes, value-added sales, just name it. There's so many taxes. And Africa in particular is susceptible to this, because for every ticket that's sold in Africa, an average of 45 to 50% of the ticket fare is taxes and charges. So this issue needs to be addressed. There's no getting around it. Of course, we've heard from the airlines as well that the efficiencies, trying to generate revenue through other means, and saving costs through efficiency is also important. So it's a whole basket of issues, but this is the key one. And as Captain Kibe said, if this can be addressed on a regional economic basis, where each region considers itself domestic for the purpose of addressing taxes and charges issues at first before going into other things, then perhaps that's a really good way forward. SATM. So I was startled. I don't know, many of you would have heard me talk about SATM many times. And I thought that I was really excited when we did an analysis from 2014 to 2019 to see how much intra-African connectivity had grown over that period of time. And the figure the analysis showed at that time was that it had grown by 39%, and that there was an additional 20-something percent in new routes. Now, when we did this study, we just completed the study you've heard about today, across all of the African countries, looking at what is the status of connectivity across Africa, I was startled to discover that 39% growth over the 5-year period was just contributing to bringing SATAM connectivity, meaning fifth freedom connectivity across Africa, to 14.4%. So what it means is that before that, this 14.4% was lower. So we were looking at the whole continent. Remember, we were looking at 12 countries before. So at the whole continent is maximum 15% connected on a fifth freedom basis, which means the ability to go from city A to B to C and back again. It's 15% of the whole of Africa. That's what we're talking about here. That's the status quo. So there's a lot of room to grow, but there's a lot of stuff to do. And we've just got to do it. That's the bottom line. That's why there's the fragmentation. That's why there's fragmentation with air transport, and that's why there's fragmentation with trade. So again, this is just a picture that shows what I've just spoken to you about. So there's a lot of traffic across Africa, yes, but it's point to point. So the blue lines are showing you exactly what the picture is across the continent. North Africa, they're connected, to each other across those North African cities. East Africa, 89%, very strong, robust connections. Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and so on. South Africa, same. South Africa, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, name it. Central and West Africa, slightly different picture. Why? Because one, they don't really have strong established carriers within that region. And two, many of those countries are landlocked, so they need air services however they can get them. And so they're more inclined to open up their markets on a fifth freedom basis. So the building blocks we heard from Brother Stephen from AFCAC earlier, this is just a summary. What is it that we need to do? The regulatory framework, simplify it, break it down, strip it down. There's Articles 2 to 6 that covers fares, capacity, and so on that he showed us before. That's it, all right? Number 2, do we continue with status quo of negotiating BASAs? Or should we just have a MASA that everybody signs up to? There's a template, and you sign up to that is YD compliant, and we move. Because the status quo is what has led to some of the slow pace of implementation. And then the regulatory text, how do we test the case? The competition rules, dispute resolution, consumer protection. Then we move to building block D, administrative framework, the concrete measures, administrative and legal capacity of the regulatory framework and the executing agency. Then the airlines framework. We've talked a lot about that today, commercial collaboration, interlining, code sharing, the technical issues, spares, tools, personnel, route connectivity, partnerships, and so on. And then under these, you use the enablers for these 3 building blocks. This is it. These are the 3 things that we need to get right. And the enablers are what? You need safety, security, infrastructure, visa openness, passenger and trade facilitation, digitization. Remove the impediments. What are they? Non-harmonization of application costs, non or late approval of carrier designations, high inspection costs. In short, the non-physical barriers to implementation of SATAM. And so what? What do we do? Well, we propose, and I think we all do, we've spoken about this so many times already, that we identify and go with that phased approach that we heard from Alan and others. Identify those countries that are ready. They've already been identified. They have a favorable aviation environment. They have all the enablers. Most of the impediments are not in place. So identify them and sit them in a room and do a lab. And get it done. And get it done. So we've got to test the case. We have 15% of SATAM implementation across Africa. That's status quo today. So we can do a lot more. So that's the next step. Our next step is working on that driving implementation and really cascading it down, breaking it down to what it means. Because, like my favorite African saying, how do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time. That's how we've got to do this, one piece at a time. Break it down into its component parts and just get it done. So these are some ideas in terms of action plans and timelines. what we need to do, how to get it together, building coalitions and so on. But there's a lot behind this very colorful slide. And the final thing, environment. So what is our focus? I think everyone knows that the industry is focused on the environment for different reasons. One, because we're proactive about it, but also because all eyes are on the industry. And as we're coming out of COVID, it's a perfect moment to try to address our environmental challenges as well. So the implementation of CORSIA, and there's during the ICAO assembly that's coming up, work is being done now to ensure that there will be agreement on the CORSIA baseline in terms of what year to use, whether it's 2019, 2020, or a combination of both. Continue with robust reporting of 2019 and 2020, and support to states on their monitoring, reporting, and verification. And of course, there is the longer-term aspiration, supporting the adoption of net zero by 2050, and this is work that we're doing, working with states and with airlines. So in a nutshell, my presentation is: one, industry is volatile, industry is vulnerable, industry is susceptible, industry should be agile. Two, regulation, somebody mentioned it, that's what it's all about. We've got to address issue of taxes, charges, and those impediments to ensuring that SATAM and aviation in Africa in general work. Three, price, costs, we've talked about that as well, and it again speaks to part of that regulatory framework which environment also sits under. So there's good news. The good news is we can do it. The good news is there's also Hotel California. So hopefully many of you will join us in checking out but never leaving. Thank you.